Today we're diving into one of the most heartbreaking true stories ever captured on reality television. You've probably seen shows where people rough it in the wild for views, but Heimo and Edna Korth weren't playing survival. They've lived off the grid in the brutal Alaskan wilderness for over 40 years, and paid an unimaginable price to do it. While most people believe wilderness living is about adventure and freedom, their story reveals something much darker. They didn't just survive snowstorms and starvation. They survived the kind of grief most of us couldn't come back from. And in this video, I'm going to walk you through the full story. How they built a life in the wild, what they lost along the way, and why they never left, even after tragedy struck. If you think you know what it means to live in isolation, this will change everything. They didn't just choose a life in the wilderness, they chose to disappear from the world. But they had no idea what that choice would one day cost them. Most people dream about escaping to a quiet cabin in the woods. Fresh air, no traffic, no bills stacking up on the kitchen counter. But Heimo and Edna Korth didn't just flirt with that fantasy. They committed to it with their entire lives, disappearing into Alaska's most unforgiving terrain, where temperatures drop below -50, and survival isn't a weekend challenge. It's a full-time job. For over 40 years, they've lived where most people wouldn't last a single week. No running water, no electricity, no safety net, just raw, brutal nature. It sounds like a simple, rustic lifestyle, right? But here's where it gets interesting. Heimo didn't grow up with snowshoes strapped to his feet or a rifle slung over his shoulder. He was raised in Appleton, Wisconsin, a place with sidewalks and streetlights, not grizzly bears and blizzards. His parents worked in a factory, lived paycheck to paycheck, and gave their son the kind of stable, structured life most people would consider secure. But from the time Heimo was a kid, that kind of life made his skin crawl. While other boys were riding bikes to baseball practice, Heimo was wandering off into the woods alone, because something deep inside him craved isolation, and that craving only grew stronger. By 18, while most teenagers were dreaming about college or coasting, through senior year, Heimo packed up and vanished into the wilds of Canada. It was the middle of the Vietnam War, and many assumed he was dodging the draft. Strangers looked at him with suspicion. No one welcomed him. But Heimo didn't care. He wasn't running from war, he was chasing something ancient. Something primal. A life ruled not by clocks or bosses, but by instinct and weather. But that's not all. He tried to make it work as a hunting guide's assistant, sleeping in cold shacks and barely affording food. Eventually, he ran out of money and limped back home to Wisconsin. Most people would have given up, but the wilderness had already claimed him. He couldn't shake it. So when he got a second shot, this time, working deep in the Brooks Range of Alaska, he didn't hesitate. He was 20 years old. And when he stepped into that vast frozen land, he never came back. Hold that thought, because it connects to something even crazier. The place he stumbled into wasn't just remote. It was the edge of the map. And what happened there would define the rest of his life and nearly destroy it. He thought he was ready for life alone in the wilderness. He was wrong, because within weeks, he almost died. After taking that one-way flight into Alaska's wilderness, Heimo was dropped off at a remote cabin with only a small stash of supplies, a few traps, and a dream. No electricity, no neighbors, no safety net. He had no idea what he was doing. He was winging it in one of the most dangerous environments on Earth. He tried to trap animals for fur and food, but failed again and again. Snow piled up, food ran out, and reality hit hard. He was completely, terrifyingly alone. But it gets worse. One day, while crossing a frozen river, the ice gave way beneath his feet. He fell in, freezing water swallowing him whole, and lost almost everything he owned: gear, supplies, and any sense of control. Soaked and shivering with no easy way back to civilization, he was stranded in sub-zero temperatures. Most people would have panicked. Heimo wrote a desperate letter to his old boss, begging for help. And just when he thought no one would answer, a check for $500 arrived, just enough to crawl back to safety. But here's the twist. Instead of giving up, Heimo used that near-death experience as fuel. He went back out, this time, even further. His next stop? St. Lawrence Island, 90 miles from Siberia, where winter swallowed the horizon and time stood still. There, in a tiny native village, he met someone who would change everything, Edna. She wasn't just another person living off the land. She was of the land. Born into the Yupik people, Edna grew up learning how to hunt, fish, and trap from her Uncle Jackson, a master trapper who taught her how to skin animals without damaging their furs and survive in the most brutal weather. She wasn't just tough, she was experienced. And soon, Heimo wasn't just learning from her family. He was becoming part of it, and that's just the beginning. He bonded with Edna's father, helped run the village store, and learned how to hunt seals and navigate the frozen sea. Jackson even joked that Edna would be Heimo's wife someday, but Heimo kept his feelings to himself. Small towns talk, and in a village that small, gossip could spread faster than wildfire. So he kept his head down and waited. Don't scroll yet. Because what started as an awkward crush would soon evolve into one of the most unbreakable partnerships the Alaskan wild has ever seen. But before they could build a life together, Heimo had one more trial to face, and this one would push him to the edge all over again. He tried to leave her behind, but when he saw her again, he knew. He wasn't meant to face the wilderness alone. After a brutal stretch surviving the Brooks Range, where food was scarce, snow was endless, and hunger was constant, Heimo had proven to himself that he could survive. But something still gnawed at him, something that couldn't be trapped or hunted: loneliness. He spent 2 long winters out there, in what locals called hungry country, a place where even wolves think twice before wandering too far. Every morning was a battle. Every night was a reminder. He was still alone. But then he made a decision that would change everything. He headed back to the village where he'd once met Edna. The plan was simple: say hello, reconnect, and maybe catch up with old friends. But the moment he saw her, everything changed. The loneliness he'd buried under layers of snow and grit rose to the surface like spring ice breaking apart. They went fishing for Dolly Varden, cruised on a motorcycle, and ended their first date with a slice of pizza. Simple things, but unforgettable when you've spent years with only the sound of wind and wolves for company. And here's where it gets even better. By the late 1970s, Edna made the trip out to see Heimo's cabin. She wanted to see what kind of life he was offering, and when she got there, she didn't hold back. The place was rough, barely more than a shelter. But instead of turning away, she challenged him. "Build me a real home." And just like that, Heimo got to work, cutting logs, hammering through exhaustion, and racing the first snowfall to finish what would become their sanctuary. The clock was ticking. For 7 straight days, Heimo worked like a man possessed. And just as the snow began to fall, the final log was placed. That cabin wasn't just shelter, it was a promise, a life together, no matter how hard. And in 1982, they made it official. Heimo and Edna got married and began the next chapter of their wild journey. One that would bring not only love and laughter, but unthinkable heartbreak. Stick with me. This next part explains everything. Because while most newlyweds worry about bills or apartment hunting, Heimo and Edna were preparing to survive one of the harshest winters on Earth. No electricity, no plumbing, no connection to the outside world, just each other and the wild. But even in that isolation, Edna carried the weight of a different kind of pain. Something from her past that would soon shape their future in ways Heimo never saw coming. Before she met Heimo, Edna had already survived heartbreak most people never recover from. And just when she thought her life was starting to make sense again, everything shattered. Years before Edna ever stepped foot in Heimo's cabin, she had fallen in love with someone else, a Swedish biologist who worked in Alaska. Together, they had 2 children, a daughter, Melinda, and a son, Merlin. Their future seemed promising, but that fragile dream came to a crashing halt. One day, her fiancé boarded a small plane for a routine flight and never came back. The aircraft went down, and he died in the crash, leaving Edna completely alone with 2 young children and no roadmap forward. But it gets even more painful. In the wake of the accident, Edna did what many strong women do. She kept going. She tried to move on, even dated someone new. But her Uncle Jackson saw right through it. The new man wasn't loyal, wasn't stable, and certainly wasn't ready to be a father. Jackson, always protective, didn't trust him. He knew Edna deserved more. Someone who wouldn't just survive in the wild, but who could carry the emotional weight that came with it. That someone, it turned out, was Heimo. Now here's the twist. Heimo didn't just fall in love with Edna, he embraced her entire world. He took on the role of a stepfather, adopting Melinda, though she only lived with them part-time. Merlin stayed with Edna's parents full-time in Savonga, a common tradition among the Yupik people, where grandparents often raised the children. Still, every goodbye carved into Edna's heart. Leaving her children behind to live in the bush was not an easy decision. But she understood something few others could. Her parents could offer stability in a way the wilderness never could. And yet, in the middle of all that pain, something beautiful bloomed. 4 months after their wedding, Edna and Heimo had their first child together, a baby girl they named Colleen, after the Colleen River near their cabin. Colleen was everything they hoped for: curious, joyful, fearless. She picked blueberries in the summer sun, rode on Heimo's shoulders, and splashed in the river with Edna. She had a wild little spirit, and an even wilder fascination with the moon, pointing up at it and shouting, "Moo! Moo!" every time it appeared in the sky. Don't scroll yet, because what happens next will break you. Edna and Heimo had already lost so much, but fate was about to take something from them they never imagined they'd have to give. Just 5 days after her second birthday, Colleen vanished beneath the water, and in one single moment, the wilderness took more from Heimo and Edna than it had in decades. They had survived isolation, starvation, brutal winters, and near-death experiences. But nothing prepared them for this. It was supposed to be an ordinary day, a short canoe trip, the kind they'd taken hundreds of times before. The river that flowed past their cabin had become part of their routine, part of their home. But rivers are like wild animals, calm until they're not. A sudden shift, an unexpected current, a single second, and Colleen was gone. But here's the part no one wants to imagine. They never found her body. One moment she was giggling on the shoreline. The next, she had disappeared into the icy current. Heimo and Edna searched desperately. They screamed her name into the trees, into the rocks, into the sky. But the silence that followed was deafening. There were no answers, no closure. Just the sound of the river moving on, as if nothing had happened. And when they finally returned to their cabin, empty-handed and broken, Heimo carved a wooden cross with Colleen's name on it, his hands shaking, his heart shattered. It gets worse. Together they carried that cross up the side of a nearby mountain, a place high enough to overlook the valley where she used to play. They placed it in the ground, hoping the wind would carry their love to wherever she had gone. But they didn't stop there. Determined to honor their daughter's memory, they petitioned the government to name the mountain after her, Mount Colleen. They collected signatures. They had the support of the governor. Even a congressman joined the cause, and yet, they were denied. Over and over, the Board of Geographic Names told them Colleen wasn't historically significant enough. As if a 2-year-old's life in the wilderness didn't count. As if a child's memory had to meet a checklist. Eventually, Heimo and Edna had to let it go, but the mountain never left them. They still call it Colleen's Mountain, and every so often they return to the cross, to the wind, to the silence that still echoes with her laughter. But listen to this. Everyone begged them to leave the bush, start over, move somewhere safe, somewhere new. But Heimo said something that stopped people in their tracks. If a couple in Dallas lost their child in a car crash, would they move just to escape the pain? The bush was their home. It was also Colleen's home. Her footprints were still in the dirt. Her voice still echoed in the trees. Leaving would have felt like losing her all over again. Stick with me. Because even after this heartbreak, they kept going. And what happened in the years that followed was nothing short of remarkable. They could have walked away from it all. But instead, they doubled down. Because even after losing their daughter, Heimo and Edna chose to stay in the very place that broke their hearts. Grief changes people. It either hollows you out, or it makes you fight for something bigger than yourself. For Heimo and Edna, It did both. In the bitter silence that followed Colleen's death, they could have abandoned the wilderness forever. But every tree, every trail, every gust of wind felt like a piece of her still lived there. So they didn't run. They stayed. They built their lives around her memory, turning tragedy into resilience. And somehow, in that same place where they experienced their greatest loss, they found a reason to keep going. But here's where it gets surprisingly beautiful. In time, Heimo and Edna welcomed two more daughters into their world, Rhonda and Kryn. Life in the wild didn't get easier, but it felt fuller again. They created a new rhythm. Trapping, hunting, fishing, raising girls in a land most people feared. Every fall, they'd stock up on supplies. Every winter, they'd retreat into their cabin, living by instinct and firelight. Rhonda and Kryn grew, up far from playgrounds and schools, but they didn't miss them. They learned to read animal tracks before they could read books. They knew how to chop wood, clean fish, and survive frostbite before most kids knew how to ride a bike. But listen to this. Heimo and Edna didn't forget Colleen, not for a second. Every so often, they would make the long journey back up to her cross on the mountain. It became a family tradition, a pilgrimage of love and memory. They never missed it. No matter how deep the snow or how heavy their hearts, they climbed that hill, stood in the wind, and remembered the little girl who once pointed to the sky and said, "Moo, moo," when she saw the moon. And that's just the beginning. Their story didn't stay hidden for long. Word of their life in the Arctic slowly began to spread, first through whispers, then through headlines. And soon, their little family, this off-the-grid team of trappers and survivors, would capture the attention of the entire world. Don't scroll yet, because what happens next launched their story from a remote cabin, straight into living rooms across America. They never asked to be famous, but their quiet life in the wild made them stars. And what started as a simple documentary turned into something that would change everything. In 1992, Heimo Korth's life caught the attention of National Geographic. A camera crew came knocking with a bold idea, a documentary called Braving Alaska, one that would follow real families surviving in some of the harshest terrain on Earth. At first, Heimo was hesitant. He didn't want his life romanticized or distorted. He'd seen how television could twist the truth, how it could turn honest struggle into cheap drama. But eventually, he agreed. And what came out of that decision was something no one expected. Here's why that matters. The documentary aired, and people were captivated, not by glitz or gimmicks, but by the raw, unfiltered way Heimo and Edna lived. They weren't playing wilderness. This wasn't a weekend camping trip. It was full-time. Survival, no safety net, no shortcuts. Just grit, grief, and tradition passed down through every trapline and every stitched piece of fur. And in the middle of it all, viewers saw something else. Heart. Real heart. Heimo's quiet determination. Edna's steady strength. Their love. Story scarred by tragedy, but unshakable. But it didn't stop there. In 2003, Heimo's cousin, James Campbell, a writer from Wisconsin, had an idea. What if he turned Heimo's story into a book? Again, Heimo hesitated. But eventually, he opened the door. Campbell traveled to Alaska and lived with the Korths for an entire season, enduring the cold, the isolation, and the silence that defines their world. What he walked away with became the best-selling book, The Final Frontiersman, published in 2004. And once again, people were drawn to the story. Not because it was glamorous, but because it was real. But hold that thought. Because it connects to something even bigger. By 2009, Vice Media arrived in the Arctic to film Surviving Alone in Alaska. The footage was stark, gritty, and impossible to ignore. No voiceovers, no stage scenes. Just Heimo and Edna, living the only way they knew how. It was haunting, beautiful. And then came the moment that would make their story a household name. In 2015, The Last Alaskans premiered on Animal Planet. This wasn't your average reality show. There were no arguments, no gimmicks, no fake danger. Just families, real ones, trying to hold on to a disappearing way of life. And among them, Heimo and Edna stood out. Not because they were loud, but because they were the heart of the series. The quiet pulse of something bigger than television. And week after week, audiences kept tuning in, drawn not by spectacle, but by soul. Stick with me, because their time on TV didn't just preserve their legacy. It revealed something deeply unexpected about who they were and what they stood for. They weren't chasing fame, they were chasing survival. But somehow, by simply living their truth, Heimo and Edna became the beating heart of a hit TV show. The Last Alaskans didn't look like anything else on television. There were no over-the-top sound effects, no dramatic music cues, no forced danger or phony fights. Instead, it offered something far more rare. Quiet moments that hit like thunder. A man chopping wood alone in the cold. A woman sewing fur gloves by firelight. A family mourning what they've lost and honoring what they still have. And in the middle of it all stood Heimo and Edna, two people who never asked for a spotlight, but whose authenticity lit up the screen. And that's just the beginning. The show ran for 4 seasons and aired 36 episodes between 2015 and 2019. Fans fell in love with the solitude, the snow, the silence. But more than that, they fell in love with the people. And while all the families on the show had compelling stories, there was something magnetic about the Korths. Maybe it was the way Heimo described his life with reverence, calling it an adventure, a joy directed by nature. Or maybe it was the way Edna carried both strength and sadness in her eyes, proof of everything she'd endured. But here's the real reason it mattered. Most so-called survival shows are about ego, about proving something, about conquering nature. The Last Alaskans was the opposite. It wasn't about conquering, it was about coexisting. It was about humility, respect. And Heimo embodied that completely. He wasn't trying to be the toughest man in Alaska. He was just trying to make it through winter, to feed his family, to hold on to a way of life that's rapidly disappearing, and it worked. He reportedly earned around $3,000 per episode. Not exactly a fortune. But that didn't matter. Money was never the motivation. For Heimo and Edna, the show wasn't a career move. It was a time capsule. A way to document a lifestyle that may never exist again. And when the cameras finally stopped rolling, when the last season aired and the world moved on, they didn't chase another show or another spotlight. They simply went back to what they'd always done, living with the land, not against it. But it gets crazier, because even after their TV fame, even after their story reached millions, their real legacy wasn't what they filmed. It was what they lived, the grief they carried, the traditions they kept alive, the mountain they climbed every year for the daughter they lost. Keep watching, because the next chapter reveals how that legacy is still growing, and who's stepping up to carry it forward. They built a life on isolation, but now, someone else is following in their footsteps, because the wild still calls to their blood. Years after The Last Alaskans ended, Heimo and Edna's 3 daughters, Melinda, Rhonda, and Kryn, had all settled into lives far from the harsh Arctic refuge. They chose warmth, safety, stability, and for a while, it seemed like the Korth legacy would end with Heimo and Edna, the last true link to a life that most people couldn't even imagine, let alone sustain. But the wilderness has a strange pull, and for one daughter, it never stopped whispering. Here's where things get interesting. Kryn, the youngest, couldn't ignore the call. Maybe it was the memories of trapping with her dad, of sewing with her mom, of watching snow fall like ash from a quiet sky. Or maybe it was something deeper, something she couldn't explain. But whatever it was, it pulled her back. Now, she and her husband are planning to return to the edge of the map, not just for nostalgia, not for TV, but to raise their son, Colby, the way she was raised, in the rhythm of the wild. But that's not all. This isn't just a trip back to a family cabin. It's a full-circle moment. Kryn wants her son to know what it means to live off the land, to understand silence, to trust instinct, to build, hunt, stitch, survive. And Heimo and Edna, now older, but no less fierce, are ready to teach him. The snowmobiles still run, the trap lines are still active, the wood still cracks in the fire. The rhythm continues. Stick with me, because this next part matters. Despite the distance, the Korth family remains tightly connected. Every summer, Heimo and Edna make the long journey to Fairbanks to spend time with their daughters and grandchildren. And every fall, when the wind sharpens and the leaves begin to fall, they return to the only place they've ever truly called home. Back to the cabin. Back to the solitude. Back to the wild. It's not easy. The years are piling up. The cold bites deeper. The weight of age hangs heavier. But still, they return. And here's why that's powerful. This isn't just survival anymore. It's legacy. It's a relay. A passing of knowledge from one generation to the next, not in textbooks or screens, but in snow and fire and silence. Kryn's return isn't just about nostalgia. It's about responsibility. She's stepping into something ancient, something sacred. And through her, Heimo and Edna's story doesn't end. It evolves. Hold that thought, because in the final part, we'll return to the place it all began and discover why Heimo says he hopes to die in the very same spot he nearly lost everything. He's trapped wolves, survived starvation, buried a child, and yet, he says he hopes to die right where it all began. Because for Heimo Korth, the wilderness isn't just home. It's everything. Most people his age are thinking about retirement plans, beachfront condos, maybe a few rounds of golf. But not Heimo. His idea of peace is riding a snowmobile through miles of untouched snow, checking trap lines in -40, with nothing but the sound of the wind and the crunch of boots on ice. And Edna? She's still sewing their winter gear. By hand, still focused, still rooted. Their bodies are older, yes, but their spirits? Still carved from the same raw, frozen ground. And here's where it all comes full circle. Even after decades, the work never stops. Heimo still traps wolverines, foxes, martens, and beavers, some of the most elusive animals on the planet. It's not about money. It never was. The fur helps. The meat feeds them. But the real reward is something money can't buy. A rhythm of life that hasn't changed in thousands of years. A routine that strips away distractions and forces you to look inward. Out there, you don't just survive nature. You become a part of it. But you won't believe this part. Among trappers, Heimo is known as one of the best wolverine hunters in North America. That reputation wasn't built on showmanship. It was built on decades of grit, of failure, of long cold nights when nothing came easy. Edna too is still active, setting traps closer to home, sewing thick parkas and gloves from scratch. Her hands have stitched more survival into their lives than any tool or weapon ever could. She's quiet, unshakable, and her strength is the kind you only see when the storms hit. And yet, it's not just about survival anymore. They've outlived most of their peers. They've been forgotten by mainstream fame. But they're still here, still in the same cabin, still climbing the same mountain every year to visit the wooden cross where their daughter's name is carved, still holding hands in the cold, still living with a pain that never left, and a love that never broke. So, what keeps them going? When asked why they never left, Heimo gave an answer so simple it stopped people in their tracks. This is our home. It's always been our home. And when the time comes, I hope I die right here. No hospital, no city, no noise, just wind, snow, trees, and memory. And now you know why. This isn't just the story of survival. It's the story of devotion, of sacrifice, of choosing love over comfort, tradition over convenience, and wilderness over the world. Heimo and Edna Korth didn't just live in Alaska, they became it.